All right, let's dive into this explainer. We're going to completely demystify those bizarre, over-the-top rituals of ancient rulers and really uncover the hidden mechanics of their power. When we look back at history, it's incredibly easy to just dismiss the pageantry of emperors and kings as nothing more than extreme vanity. We see the gold, the massive monuments, the crazy rules of court, and we think, wow, what an ego trip. But actually, beneath all that glittering surface lies a really fascinating blueprint for societal control. Today, we're unpacking exactly how these ancient sovereigns used seemingly magical rituals not just to show off, but to actually run massive, complex empires. We're moving way past the myths and looking directly at the cold, hard logistics. Imagine, just for a second, the visceral isolation of being the Byzantine emperor. Your entire existence was a literal performance. You weren't allowed to just be a regular person. You were mandated to be this silent, distant statue of power. Literally, you were strictly forbidden to even speak to foreigners. I mean, think about what that actually means. Every single movement, every moment of silence was so heavily choreographed to project an image of something totally untouchable, almost non-human. You were basically a living, breathing prop in the theater of your own empire. It sounds completely exhausting, doesn't it? But here's the thing. This intense isolation wasn't an accident. It was a deeply calculated mechanism to maintain a very specific aura of authority over thousands of people. Part 1. The Theater of Power and Gods. Let's see how this heavy burden of theatrical power was actually a foundational strategy utilized across the entire ancient world. This perfectly illustrates how rulers globally tied themselves to the very fabric of reality to keep that awe alive. Take the Egyptian concept of the living royal Ka. Now, this wasn't just a metaphor. This was a systemic process of transforming a mortal human heir into a literal walking god on earth. It's the absolute ultimate elevation of status. But then contrast that entirely with the Chinese mandate of heaven. This strategy was completely different, but equally profound. It tied a ruler's political legitimacy directly to the natural world, specifically to natural disasters. So if there were floods or famines, it literally meant heaven was withdrawing its mandate. Think about that. One system makes the ruler a god, while the other makes the ruler personally responsible for the whims of nature. Both are massive, sweeping, theatrical claims designed for one thing: solidifying absolute loyalty. So the really crucial question here is this. Were these ancient leaders simply obsessed with elaborate pageantry, or did this suffocating theater actually serve a highly calculated purpose? Like, were they getting high on their own supply, genuinely believing they were divine? Or were these grand claims of being gods and controlling the weather actually masking something incredibly practical? Because as we know, running an empire requires a whole lot more than just a good costume and a dramatic persona. It requires feeding people, moving massive amounts of resources, and keeping the literal gears of society turning. Section 2. The Symbolic Ecology Reframe. All right, enter symbolic ecology. This is a scientific concept that totally reframes how we look at historical leadership. It reveals that these theatrical religious rituals were actually a highly sophisticated cover for managing logistics, resources, and entire populations. When the emperor performed a sacred rite, it wasn't just a prayer to the heavens, right? It was actually the trigger for an entire economic and logistical cascade. The ritual was simply the interface, the shiny button the public saw and believed in, while the actual mechanics of taxation, food distribution, and infrastructure maintenance operated perfectly smoothly right underneath it. Honestly, it is brilliant when you think about it. You don't have to explain complex macroeconomics to your population, you just have to perform the ritual perfectly, and boom, the system basically runs itself. Section 3. The Mechanics of Control. Because behind that grand facade of divine right and those untouchable statues of power, there were incredibly pragmatic engines at work. For example, the Inca Mita might have been framed within the context of sacred duties to the empire, but the reality, it was a highly organized labor tax. It systematically managed resources to do things like feed the elderly. It was literally a social safety net powered entirely by religious obligation. Similarly, while we often just remember the Mongols for their brutal conquests, their true underlying mechanic of control was the yam. This was a sprawling, deeply organized message network that allowed them to communicate faster than anyone else on Earth at the time. So whether it was framing a labor tax as a divine duty to care for the vulnerable, or building the world's absolute fastest information highway, the quote-unquote magic was always just exceptional, highly coordinated logistics. And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway of this explainer.
Since successful leadership throughout all of human history has always been about balancing symbolic performance with actual physical resource distribution, we really have to look in the mirror. We aren't living in the times of the Byzantine emperor or walking Egyptian gods anymore, sure, but the fundamental mechanics of human society, they haven't really changed. So I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. What theatrical rituals are we buying into right now? What are the modern pageants and performances our leaders are using today to manage populations? And what logistical realities are operating silently right behind them?